when is good good enough? And when is good not good enough? When does it need to be a very good or even an excellent job or result? Well, the answer is it depends. There are certain situations when the maximum or close to the maximum quality that is possible is worth pursuing. For instance, if the topic, the subject matter, the task at hand is something that has to do with security, a major security issue. I'm very happy that, for instance, a client of mine, they produce engines of airplanes, don't go for 80 or 90% solutions in most situations, but rather have a very high quality standard. I'm very grateful for that. For instance, when people or organizations are competing for something and there's only one winner, let's say you and 4 other organizations are competing for a very attractive client, and then you end up with 2nd place. Well, that appears to be nicer than 5th place, but in reality, the end result is basically the same no matter whether you come in 2nd or 5th. So that's a situation when you're in competition with other people or other organizations, and there's only one winner, and the winner takes it all. In that case, that's a situation where you'll most likely want to go for a very high level of quality and put just about as much as you can into that topic. That reminds me of a situation where 2 people are in the wilderness and walking around. They're very relaxed, took their shoes off, and they're relaxed until one of the 2 of them sees behind them a bear, a few hundred yards or meters, whatever, away behind them. This bear is accelerating, is coming closer and closer, quicker and quicker. And one of them kneels down and puts his shoes back on, his sneakers back on, and the other one, as he's running away, says, "Listen, are you totally crazy? Do you think that through your sneakers you're going to be faster than the bear?" And he says, "No, but through the shoes I'm going to be faster than you." So just a little bit of a humorous way of pointing out that there's certain situations, for instance, competitive situations where there's a winner and a loser, or a winner and other competitors. It's very useful to be just a tiny bit ahead of everybody else. But when is good good enough? I'm sure everyone has encountered situations where we ourselves or other people we observed put a lot more effort into something than was necessary. And what I find very useful, especially when you receive a task from somebody else, is to spend just a little bit more time talking to the person about the desired outcome, about the desired end result, defining the goal, asking the person questions about what kind of quality are you expecting. Do you want just a rough solution, just a rough image, or do you want something very, very precise that we can actually produce then? What is it you need? What's the background? So try to understand just a little bit more what actually the topic is about, what the desired outcome is, in order to not put a lot more time into something than the person giving you the task had actually intended. And I'm sure you've also seen situations, witnessed situations where, let's say, somebody is going to give a speech, informal speech in front of, let's say, 10 colleagues, and it's a topic of, let's say, medium importance, not the most important topic on the planet, but it does have some relevance, of course, otherwise the person wouldn't be speaking on the topic. And the person invests, let's say, an hour into the content and making sure that the, let's say, PowerPoint presentation looks decent, looks okay, looks fine. And then the person invests another full hour just so that individual elements float in from the top right to the left bottom with music at the same time. I think that's a quite valid example of somebody putting a lot more effort into something than the benefit justifies. So my question to you is, where are areas where you possibly, because you simply enjoy the activities or because you're a little bit perfectionist oriented or whatever the motivation and the reason behind it is, where are areas where you put more into something than it's really worth? And possibly on the other side, on the other hand, there are other areas where you should put in just a little bit more effort in order to be just a little bit ahead of everybody else. Transparency. How does transparency relate to time management and effectiveness and productivity? A very simple exercise I'd like to propose, and that is, during the course of the next week or the next 5 work days, keep track of what you actually did. That sounds very simple, and actually it is pretty simple. And I don't mean in terms of planning. When you plan something, then you look at the future. What I mean is, as soon as you've completed a task, let's say the precision of 10, 15, 20-minute intervals, keep track of what you actually did. So as an example, let's say on Monday morning from 8 to 9, you work on your emails. That's good enough. Write down 1 hour emails. Then you spend 25 minutes on the phone with a particular client, for instance. Then write down 25 minutes phone call, client XYZ. Then you spent 15 minutes chatting with somebody who just happened to drop into your office. Nothing really important, just kind of chatting. Then write down 15 minutes chatting. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong. That's up to you then. At the end of the day, at the end of the week, look at how you actually spent your time. What do you do when you try and improve a process? Well, first of all, you look at the status quo. You look at what the process is like right now. And then you start thinking about how you can improve it. You question how you can do this a little bit differently, do that a little bit differently, solve this step in a different way. And the same thing happens with the usage of your time if you establish the status quo. You know at the end of the week how you really spent your time. Not every second, not every minute, but there's hardly a block of more than about 5 minutes that you don't know how you spent it. What's the effort to do that? Well, maybe 2 or 3 minutes per day to jot down what you did and how long it took. So 10 or 15 minutes extra that you need to do this for a whole week, depending on how detailed you actually conduct this assignment or suggestion. And the benefit is that you will find things that are going well and you will find things that you can easily improve. Now, some of these improvements, as I said, are easy to implement. Some of them will require talking to other people that you work with on a regular basis. But the point is, I've basically never encountered anybody who seriously wrote down what the person did and how long it took, had a serious look at it, and the conclusion was my time management is perfect. To be precise, I did have one person in an event who came up to me and said, yeah, I've done that a couple of times and I know my time management is perfect. I'm not sure whether the person was serious or not, but I seriously doubt that that was the case. So that's my recommendation. Write down what you did, how long it took for about a week. There's nothing wrong with doing that again, for instance, a month later. I don't necessarily recommend to do that every week, but rather, for instance, for 1 week, and then a month later for a week, and then again, and do that a few times in order to see whether the same topics pop up or whether you've actually changed a few things. And usually it's a combination of things that you discovered after you did it the first time. There are 5 things you want to improve. For instance, spend less time in meetings, delegate more or more precisely, then group certain things together a little bit more, just as an example. And let's say out of those 5 findings you had and 5 things you want to improve, usually it's a mixture of things that you actually changed and other things that you wanted to change but didn't. And both are useful. The former to see that you actually made improvements, and the latter, well, to be reminded that you should make some changes. The gas principle. What does gas do? Well, a lot of things, but it tends to expand as much as possible, as much as the gas has room until it reaches limits, physical limits in this case. What about tasks? Don't tasks tend to expand as well, as far as they can? In this case, not physical limits, but time limits or time restrictions. Now, what does this have to do with time management? Well, let's say you're right here and the deadline is right here. Then the closer you get to the deadline without starting the task, the higher the pressure, the higher your time pressure and therefore stress level. Now, my recommendation first sounds theoretical, and it is theory, and I'll give you a couple of tips on putting it into practice, is that if you're here and this is the actual deadline, that you define a different earlier deadline and plan based on that deadline. So that means plan to be done, work backwards from that deadline, that imaginary earlier deadline, and plan to be done by that deadline. Now, what are the advantages? Well, of course, you have less pressure towards the end, and if something goes wrong, something takes longer than expected, you have this extra time. Now, that sounds great in theory. Usually, participants at this point say or think something along the following lines, and that is, Mr. Davis, but I can't fool myself. I know that it doesn't have to be finished until here. I can tell myself it has to be finished by this earlier point in time as much as I want until I'm blue in the face, but I know that in reality it doesn't have to be done until later on. And the other day somebody said, yeah, that's kind of like trying to tickle yourself. It doesn't work. By the way, just as a side note, you can try tickling yourself. It has nothing to do with time management. It's of no practical importance as far as I'm aware of, but it just doesn't work. Anyhow, back to our deadlines. You're here. I'm suggesting to plan based on an earlier deadline. How can we actually put that into practice? A very effective way of viewing this is to point out to yourself that when you're here, you have two choices. One choice is to start earlier. That requires a certain fairly low level of self-discipline, but it does require some self-discipline, some willpower to start earlier and therefore finish earlier. That's one option. The other option is to simply wait, and that sounds more attractive right now. But what I suggest is to point out to yourself that the price of starting right now is a small price with respect to self-discipline, willpower, compared to the very large price you're going to pay towards the end by being forced to get a certain activity finished and having no flexibility. You'll have a very high stress level. And it's very useful to, as I said, point out to yourself early on when you still have the choice to start earlier that in both cases, no matter which choice you make, you're going to pay a price. But in one case, it's a small price now compared to a much larger price you would pay later on if you procrastinate. A story or metaphor that was made popular mainly by Stephen Covey is the metaphor of the sawyer. The story goes along the lines of there's a sawyer in the woods and somebody else walks by and this pedestrian recognizes the sawyer. How does he recognize the sawyer? Well, based on the saw and the activity he's sawing. Those are very conclusive pieces of evidence that we see a sawyer in front of us. In any case, the other pedestrian observes the situation for a few minutes and then goes over to the sawyer and says, Mr. Sawyer, I'm not sure whether you're aware, but your saw is very dull. And then the sawyer goes, yeah, I know, but I don't have any time to sharpen the saw because I have to finish my project. Now, there are a lot of ways of telling this story, but the point is this metaphor of not having any time to sharpen the saw. What does it really mean? By the way, it's actually one of the 7 principles of the best-selling book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by the mentioned Stephen Covey. What is meant by sharpening the saw? It's a metaphor, no more, no less. Well, what I mean by it in any case is time for planning purposes. Well, some people exaggerate the amount of time that they spend planning. Some people love to plan all day long and don't have to ever execute anything, only semi-serious. So time, a reasonable amount of time to plan your day, your month, the task. Time to educate yourself on technical things, on non-technical topics, to increase your skill set in various different areas that are relevant. Taking time for your health, taking time to simply take a break, 5 minutes, a midday lunch break, having a weekend that actually is free of work, going on vacation. There are a lot of things that can be understood under the headline of sharpening your saw. What I'm trying to get to is very often people say something about, I don't have, something along the lines of, I don't have any time to sharpen the saw. Rarely do people explicitly say, I don't have any time to sharpen the saw. But if you pay attention to statements that people often make, they are often very parallel to the statement of no time to sharpen the saw. I don't have any time to get into this topic deeply and to really understand the problem. Or I don't have any time to explain to my colleague or my employee how to conduct this activity. I don't have any time to spend more time with my clients or key decision makers. Or. I could give a lot of examples. And what I'd like to ask you is, what are the areas where you should spend more time sharpening the saw? And what are possibly, if you want to go one level deeper, what are situations where you tend to possibly say something like, I don't have any time to sharpen the saw, and in reality, it's costing you more time not to put time into it than you're saving by avoiding the topic or putting it off into the future. The topic of procrastination. Now, don't worry, you're not going to get the tip or the hints at, like you've heard from probably numerous sources, don't procrastinate, start early. That's not wrong. I'm not making it wrong at all. I'm getting at a different aspect. And actually, I did say something about start with the big rocks, don't procrastinate. But in this section, this tip is to become a master of procrastination. Now, some people might feel like, that sounds very good, that's a competence that I already possess. What do I mean by become a master of procrastination? Well, there are certain activities that are not so important and not so valuable or value creating that it is actually quite reasonable to put them off. That is much more reasonable than to put things off that are much more important, that create much more value, that give you or the organization or division much more leverage in the desired direction. Another aspect with respect to become a master of procrastination is to realize that it's easy to say that you need to prioritize things. You need to do certain things first. Again, I said something about start with the big rocks. Yes, I support statements like that. But what people often forget is if you're going to define something that in future needs to have a higher level of priority, you need to define something else that needs to have a lower level of priority. It's very easy, for instance, for, let's say, an executive to say to his employee, you need to focus on C more than on B. But what needs to be said as well is that if you're going to focus on, let's say, C more in future, is what you're going to be able to focus on less in future. So it's not only important to define priorities, but rather also, I'm not sure if there's such a word, posteriorities. That means if you're going to spend more time doing something, well, then you need to spend less time doing something else. If you're going to take on an additional set of activities that might be very useful, very valuable, you need to define something else that you're going to do less in future or not at all anymore, or somebody else is going to do. So I strongly suggest, no matter whether you're talking to your boss or you're talking to somebody to whom you are the executive, the boss, or whether you're self-employed, an entrepreneur, whenever you find yourself thinking about, talking about things that need to be focused on more, ask yourself the question, what do we need to let go of? What do we need to focus on less in order to make it possible to focus on certain things more in future? I'd say just about everybody in their business life, and also personal life for that matter, uses a phone or numerous phones. I'd like to give you a few quick, but I find very powerful tips on the topic of using a phone and carrying on effective and efficient phone conversations. The first thing is very, very basic, so basic that it almost sounds strange to explicitly mention it, and that is before you call somebody to at least write down individual bullet points, topics that you want to talk to the person about. Maybe this sounds too basic, but I'd make the statement that at least half, and I think that's very conservative, of all business phone calls are not prepared even for 10, 15 seconds by jotting down the 3 or 4 points that the person calling wants to cover. And what are the advantages of jotting down the points that you want to talk about? Well, first of all, you won't forget any point. Now, I'm sure this has never happened to you, but maybe you know somebody who called somebody else up and wanted to talk about 3 topics and has covered the first 2 topics and knows there was a third topic but just can't remember what that third topic was. Now, when do we tend to remember what the topic was? Well, just after we hung up. As I said, I'm sure this has never happened to you, but maybe you know other people that this has happened to. Seriously, if you write down what you want to talk about, you will not forget anything, and also you'll typically get through the points a little bit more quickly, a little bit more efficiently. And another advantage is sometimes we just, in a conversation, tend to go from the main road to a side road, out into the woods, and you typically get back from the woods to the main road within the conversation, figuratively speaking, if you have the individual points that you want to talk to the person about right in front of you. So that's the very first, very basic point. Another tip I'd like to give you is for people that you talk to on a fairly regular basis, let's say on average a couple times a week, I would recommend to collect the topics that you want to talk to the person about. Okay, that's very simple, but actually put them in a place where you can access these notes very, very quickly. What's the logic and the reasoning behind that? Well, let's say it's Monday and you're planning on calling this person on, let's say, Friday. It's not an agreed upon point in time that you're going to talk, but you're just planning on calling him on Friday, possibly on Thursday already, towards the end of the week in any case. So, and you've written down 4 topics that you want to talk to the person about. And let's say you've put it into the comment section of the contact of that person, wherever you keep your contact information, or some other place where you can access it really quickly. And let's say this person unexpectedly calls you on Wednesday already. And of course, this person has a reason for calling, and you talk about those topics. And maybe out of the 4 topics you want to talk to the person about, one of them is already covered. But there are 3 left. Now, if you can access quickly and efficiently access those other topics, or those 4 topics in total, one of which has been covered, you can resolve these 3 other topics in the same conversation. Now, of course, the phone conversation will be a little bit longer, but the total effort is usually significantly less if you have cover all these topics in just one conversation rather than having 2 separate conversations. Something else I would like to suggest, and that is, some people use this regularly, and a lot of people don't make use of it at all, and that is to arrange telephone appointments more frequently. Of course, there's nothing wrong with talking to somebody without it being pre-appointed, but there are quite a few advantages when you've pre-appointed a particular time that you're going to talk. Let's say from 3 p.m. to 3:20 p.m. You've assigned a 20-minute, for instance, period of time. You're going to talk to a particular other person, and you've possibly even defined the topics that you're going to talk about. What are the advantages? Well, there's lots of advantages. One advantage is that the person calling has a much higher likelihood of actually reaching the other person. Now, sometimes the person, even if it's appointed, is not reachable, but I'd say in about 9 out of 10 cases, the caller actually reaches the person who's being called at the appointed time. That's one advantage. So fewer times will you try and reach somebody and not get a hold of the person. Another advantage is the person who's being called is not going to be ripped out of some other task. The person is prepared for your call in general, and also that person has the opportunity to prepare for the call, prepare with respect to the points that are supposed to be covered. Now, not always will this person do so, but at least the person is mentally prepared. At least for a few seconds, the person typically will have thought about the other person calling. So there are quite a few advantages to pre-arranged appointments on the phone if we compare it to regular phone conversations. And very often, also, it makes sense to not meet in person, but rather talk on the phone or have a video conference. Sometimes there are very good reasons to travel someplace else or go to a different building, other end of the city, other end of the country, or other end of the planet, and have a face-to-face meeting. Of course, there are often very good reasons to do so. But very often, a video conference can be a very good substitute for a personal meeting. So what I'm trying to say is, think about how you can save time on the phone by just jotting down the topics you want to talk about, just short form, by pre-arranging appointments, and question whether you actually need to go to the site of the client or the vendor or somebody else, whether the person can come to you, or whether a phone conversation or a video-based conference would be a very good, just as good or almost as good substitute and actually save you a lot of time. Meetings. I'm sure you've spent time in meetings, and at the end of the meeting, you thought to yourself, wow, that was a really, really good usage of my time. The 8 of us really solved some problems. It was really productive. It was really constructive. And I'm also sure that you've spent time in meetings and asked yourself the question, what am I doing here? Why am I spending my time in this meeting? Or had the thought, this is such a waste of time for me and probably most or all of the other people who are here. Now, there's not always a perfect solution to ineffective meetings, but I'd like to give you 4 tips that are all related that are very powerful instruments to influence meetings effectively. For the positive, that is, of course. And the first thing is, now we need to distinguish a little bit whether you were the person organizing the meeting, inviting other people, or whether you're simply one of the participants, one of the people who were invited. In any case, I strongly recommend that there should be an agenda. Now that sounds very basic, but also I strongly recommend that that agenda is not only created, but distributed among all the participants beforehand. Now, if you're the person organizing the meeting, it's up to you to simply create a very reasonable agenda and distribute it in a timely manner. If you're one of the people who are being invited, what I suggest, if you don't get an agenda without asking for it, I strongly suggest that you ask for the agenda. And what I typically do is I say, okay, thanks for the invitation. Could you please send me the agenda so that I can prepare? And that's a very legitimate reason. And actually, there are 2 reasons for asking for the agenda. One is the one that I explicitly said, and that is that if I attend a meeting, I do want to have the opportunity to prepare. The other thing, the other aspect may be said implicitly. In any case, a second reason for asking for the agenda is that I want to make sure that the person organizing the meeting has put some thoughts into what's supposed to happen during that meeting. And you get one of 2 reactions. Either the person is kind of relaxed and says, sure, I'll send it to you by email in just a second, or the person goes, and you know at that point the person has not spent any time, any significant amount of time, thinking about how this meeting is going to go, what it's going to be about, how he's going to ensure that it's going to be a productive meeting. That's the first thing. So ensure that there's an agenda and that you receive it or you distribute it depending on which role you have. The second thing also has to do with the agenda, and that is that I strongly recommend that the topics that are supposed to be covered in the meeting are grouped according to particular people or functional areas. What I mean by that is, let's say there are 10 topics that are supposed to be covered. Very often, people are in the meeting from the beginning to the end, even if only the first 4 topics are relevant to them or their area or division. And then there are other people who are there for the topics 4 to 7, and there are a few people who wait forever until the topics that are relevant for them, namely 8 to 10, are covered. It's an unspoken rule in most organizations that if you attend a meeting, you need to be there from the beginning to the end. I don't think that that's a very reasonable rule. Sometimes there are good reasons to just stay there, even if you can't really contribute in a meaningful way and it's not relevant for you or your division. Sometimes there are good reasons to do so. For instance, if it's a very first meeting with, let's say, a key client, you don't want to make a negative impression by just leaving and create the impression possibly that you're not interested or that they are not your number 1 priority. So there are exceptions to this. But very often, especially with internal meetings, and it's often with external meetings with clients or vendors, it's very well possible to rearrange the meeting points, the topics that are supposed to be covered, such that certain people don't have to be there from the beginning to the end of the meeting. Then the third suggestion I'd like to give you is that every topic that's supposed to be covered, and obviously is on the agenda in a reasonable order, those are the first 2 topics we just covered, that every topic is assigned a period of time, a maximum amount of time that it's allowed to take. So that could be a maximum of a minute, because it's just a quick piece of information and then just defined maximum 1 minute. Or it's something slightly more complex and you define a maximum of 10 minutes or 5 minutes or 8 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever. So what's the point? Well, on average, it doesn't take as long. And you can ensure that or increase the likelihood dramatically if you have somebody, and that's my fourth recommendation, that you or the group assigns one person. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter whether it's somebody who's far up in the hierarchy or low down. It has nothing to do with the hierarchy, who gets the responsibility and the authority by the group to make sure that the time is kept. So that means, let's say you have one topic that's supposed to take a maximum of 10 minutes. Then, for instance, it could be reasonable to arrange that this person, after 5 minutes, is going to give some sort of a signal. It's not going to interrupt the flow of the conversation, as long as it's productive, but everybody's going to be aware that half the time is over, and then possibly a minute before the time is over, and when it's over, maybe you'll give 1 minute extra time. The point is, the 10 minutes, the maximum of 10 minutes, theoretically, maximum of 10 minutes, do sometimes turn into 11 or 12 minutes, but now very rarely turn into 24 minutes, as an example. So those are my 4 recommendations. Firstly, there should be an agenda, and that should be distributed beforehand. The topics that are supposed to be covered should be in an order that makes sense, so that not everybody necessarily has to be there from the beginning to the end. Then every topic should have a maximum amount of time that is going to be spent on it. There is an exception to that, of course, if there's a certain problem that needs to be solved, urgently needs to be solved because it's costing you a lot of money or reputation or whatever, then you simply need to spend as much time as it takes to solve the problem. There are exceptions. And the fourth recommendation is that there's somebody who pays attention to the process and that the time that is assigned is actually kept and respected.